Welcome to Podcast, the Business of Dentistry Podcast, brought to you by Practice Plan. Podcast delivers the best business advice, real-life stories, and practical hints and tips to make your practice a more profitable and sustainable business. And now, here's your host.
Hello, my name's Hazel Dockery and welcome to the latest podcast. With me today is Sarah Buxton, HR and Employment Specialist. Hello Sarah, thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And it's always a pleasure to have you here. Now, what we're going to be talking about today are all things pregnancy and family, really. So if you'd like to just, first of all, introduce yourself and then we'll move on to that, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. So I am Sarah Buxton. I'm a HR and Employment Solicitor. I'm also a director of Buxton Coates Solicitors. It's a family-run law firm where I run it with my husband, Thomas Coates, and we act in all aspects of buying, selling and running a dental practice all over England and Wales.
Right, so anything to do with buying, selling, running a dental practice, you're the people to come to then.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Okay, then that's great. So there have been some changes recently to legislation regarding things around stuff like miscarriages, and it's a really sad subject that we're talking about, I'm afraid, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
So what's the current legislation on miscarriage and, well, we'll start with miscarriage and then we can move on to stillbirth.
Yeah, of course. I think it's really great that we are doing this podcast today because I think it is a sensitive subject and it can be emotive for a lot of people. And I think one of the difficulties that we have in the workplace is that because of the emotions involved in it, people don't always feel comfortable discussing it with their employer. And quite often the employers don't feel comfortable discussing it with their team members, and they don't know where to go for advice. And it's really important that in some of these situations, which may be some of the biggest hurdles or biggest life-changing experiences that a team member has to go through, that as an employer or a manager or even a colleague within a practice, that you know how to deal with that and help and support. So I think it's really important that we are speaking about it today. I think it's also really important because we are thin on the ground when it comes to the legislation in respect of what an employer should do in these situations. The legislation, in my opinion, is quite outdated, and we could do with the government looking at this area to bring it up to date. So if we take miscarriage, there is no legislation protecting or setting out exactly what an individual should receive in those circumstances. And when I mean receive, I mean in terms of leave, pay, support. So miscarriage at the moment is statutory when a woman loses a baby before 24 weeks. They don't receive maternity pay. There's no miscarriage leave or pay in those circumstances. And basically the individual has to rely on the practice's sickness, absence, procedures and policy. Which in those circumstances may not be enough. They may need more time. It might be something where the practice decides to pay them for a certain amount of time whilst they feel able to return to work. It may be that the practice decides to give some flexible working so they can have a phased return to work. The practice may feel as though they need to point them in the direction of support and counselling, but there's nothing statutory, which means basically there's no law telling you have to do this. It's down to the practice and what they want to provide to their staff in that situation.
So would you recommend that they had a policy about that?
I would hugely recommend that they have a policy in respect of what happens in that situation. I'm a great believer in, I refer to them as well-being policies.
Yeah.
And these are the policies that basically look after the well-being of the team. And to have these sort of policies in place make it quite clear how an employer will deal with these situations, that they're looking after the well-being of the team. It helps with recruiting staff and it helps with retaining staff. Because the staff member knows that you're there to help them in a situation where they probably need some support. And having these policies in place really ensures that the team speak about these situations. It enables a conversation to be had, which I think is really important, because if we have a culture where we are happy to discuss and talk about certain life situations that happen, then that's where we feel more comfortable and we can feel part of the family. And I think it's really important that the starting point is the policy to enable you to have those good conversations.
So if there isn't any statutory laws and rules and regulations, how easy is it for someone as a practice owner to fall foul when dealing with someone in these sort of circumstances?
From a legal perspective, there's no standalone legislation that says the employee must be treated in this way. This is the bottom line. You must give them leave. You must give them time off. But what happens is, there's very little risk legally, but the risk here is that if you don't support that employee through this very difficult time, that you may lose that employee because you haven't been there for them in the time when they needed you the most. So legally, very little risk, but the bigger picture here is that you may end up losing a very good team member.
And possibly others as well, if they're not happy about the way the person's being treated. Yes. I can see that. So I believe that the legislation is a bit more clear about stillbirth.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So what are the circumstances there then?
So after 24 weeks, you can exercise maternity leave. It's the statutory maternity provisions, unless the practice owner wants to provide them with any further additional pay. So again, the protection there is higher than for one who miscarriages, because they have the protection from the protected characteristic of pregnancy and or maternity, and that protected characteristic falls into your equality and diversity policy, whereby if you treat them differently or discriminate or associated with, or they suffer a detriment because of this scenario, then the consequences legally are huge, because they can make a claim to the employment tribunal for that discrimination.
And what's the possible punishment with that?
So in respect of the discrimination legislation, the compensation awarded in the employment tribunal is unlimited.
Oh my goodness, so that could actually send a practice under that, really, couldn't it?
Yeah, definitely, because it's whatever the judge believes is fair and equitable. And don't get me wrong, there's bandings as to how a judge would exercise their discretion over the compensation payment. But it is the eye-watering amounts that we hear about in the media. So it's really important that they are treated. I mean, don't get me wrong, I truly believe everybody should be treated with support and respect.
Yeah.
But in this situation, you've just got to be more aware that they are protected and look after their needs.
So it's not just about doing the right thing to be a good person, it's about doing the right thing to stay on the right side of the law.
Absolutely.
As well. Yeah.
But quite often, as we've already said, just like with miscarriage, the law is the minimum that you have to provide. I think looking at retaining the team, looking at recruiting, looking at having a happy, profitable team, and having that family that I think most practices strive to have, the law is definitely the minimum. You need to look over and above that as to what you want to provide to them what your team needs. And that does come down to looking at well-being and what you can offer them in that situation. And you can't always offer them everything. And I'm not talking about remuneration here.
No.
It doesn't always have to be money.
No.
It can be having the opportunity to have flexible working. It can be meeting them and having a good chat with them in the local coffee shop once a week. There's lots of things you can do that isn't always about giving them paid leave, and I think sometimes people miss that point because they think that that's what it's all about, but it isn't. It's about being there for the team, having open conversations, and if it gets to the point where maybe you don't know how to support that person, knowing where that person can go so that you can provide the support to them.
I guess. Now, these are, in these cases we've just been talking about, pregnancy that happens without any kind of intervention. What are the IVF? How does that come into play?
Yeah, so IVF and assisted conception, again, we have very little legislation in respect of what happens when somebody's going through this process, this procedure. And actually, when you consider what's involved, it mentally, it can be quite draining, quite stressful on an individual. And although we have no legislation, I think an employer's role is to ensure that they are there to support the team members. And we've already spoken about some scenarios which they can do.
Yeah.
But I think what's important here is maybe we need to understand when appointments are taking place, and how you can assist them and work with them, as well as them working with you, to ensure that there's minimal disruption to the day, but they don't have any statutory time off to have those appointments.
Right.
And it will be down to the practice.
So what, the practice could either just make an informal arrangement and allow them to either work flexibly or take it as annual leave?
Yeah, I think the difficulty with taking it as annual leave, they can do that, of course, or unpaid leave, you can take that time off. But I think it's really good if some practices may consider additional leave in this situation, because the idea about annual leave is that an employee is given the time to rest. And if you're taking your annual leave to go and have medical appointments, then you're not taking that time to rest. And there's lots of statistics out there about when staff are given the time to rest, productivity goes up.
Right.
And they'll be happier at work. So we have lots of different types of leave, and we have more to come, and we've had some more introduced this year, because the concept behind it is don't eat into their annual leave, let them rest. And then if they have medical appointments, it may be something to consider paid or unpaid leave for that individual.
Right. Well, you just sort of alluded to what I'm going to move on to next is we've got a newish government, and they appear to have produced a raft of recommendations as far as workers' rights and things like that are concerned. How do you see things going in the future? Do you think we're going to have more changes?
I do, yeah. This has definitely been a government of workers' rights. I mean, one of the first documents they published was Make Work Pay, basically, and it's the biggest overhaul in employment legislation as what I can remember for a long time. So there are lots and lots of changes. Some of the focus is on well-being of the team and what they can do to make the well-being of the team a bit more of a focus. In terms of they are looking at introducing parental leave as a day one right, rather than you only get parental leave after 12 months service. Paternity leave, you had to have 26 weeks service to take paternity. Again, that's going to be day one right. Bereavement leave, very little legislation in respect of bereavement leave in this country. We have parental bereavement leave and pay, but that is very new. it's only been in for a couple of years, where if you have a child that passes away, you have 2 weeks paid leave, either after the death, or you can take it 1 year after the anniversary of the death, and that's statutory paid leave. But everything else, bereavement-wise, is down to the employer and what they believe they should provide and pay. So I think there's scope there for that to be extended as well, because bereavement really affects the well-being of an individual, and at the moment they have to take annual leave after dependent emergency leave if they need to take that type of leave, lots of leave going on. So it's I think that's going to be expanded. What's interesting about bereavement leave is that we don't have, for bereavement leave, pay or leave in this country, only parental, but there are consultations done about how far that should extend, even to pets. Because if you have a pet and they're dependent on you, and that can really affect the team member and their well-being. So it'd be interesting to know how far it goes. But this government is definitely one for changing the employment legislation, so that who knows what will happen and what will come in. But I think definitely in respect of what we've discussed today, miscarriage, IVF, bereavement, I think we will see a lot of changes on the cards.
And how does a poor practice manager or practice owner keep up with all this? I mean, it's your full-time job, it's your career, and they're doing other things as well, aren't they? So how would you advise them to keep up with things?
Yeah. I will often say, it's one plate that an employer or a practice manager is spinning. And it's a very difficult one at the moment because of how fast the employment legislation is changing. Mm-hmm. The worry is just because you've always done something in a certain way, you shouldn't keep doing it that way because it's probably changed. So we need to look at ways to make sure that we keep on top of the legislation. Mm-hmm. And it's not going online into some of the forums. Because some of the information on there is quite misleading. I think it's ensuring that you've got HR and employment support with people who you're very comfortable with, who take liability for that advice that they're providing. And I think actually moving forward, I think because it is going to get so difficult, I think if you don't have that HR support, you will end up tripping yourself up. And we've already discussed the type of compensation that could be made out if you do it wrong. So I think it's really important to make sure that you take support from the appropriate HR person, and at Books and Coats, that's what we do. Yeah.
You're going to be busy, I think. That's my prediction for the future. You're going to be in a job for a long time.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for spending the time with us, Sarah. I mean, I've learned an awful lot there, so I hope other people who are listening have as well. But it's great to have you back. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.